What's up, YouTube? Static in the Attic. Welcome to part 2, indicating if you have not watched part 1, you might want to do that. We've been going through Sasha Dobler's work here over at abruptearthchanges.com. About forgot it there. He did some excellent research, some excellent work. I highly recommend everybody go check it out for yourselves. I will leave it in the links. We left off on the last video right here, and we were talking about the artwork portraying all of these arrows and it possibly being a sign of the plague in artwork, and left off with the Greek lawmaker Solon, however you say that. The fact is that wherever the extremity of winter frost or summer sun does not prevent, the human race is always increasing at times and at other times diminishing in numbers. And whatever happened, either in your country and ours, or in any other region of which we are informed, all that has been written down of old and is preserved in our temples, and then at the usual period the stream from heaven descends like a pestilence, and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education, and thus you have to begin all over as children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves. This was Solon and the Egyptian priests, and I mentioned that, hey, if we had bad catastrophes right now and things went horribly wrong in the world, I don't think many of us would be sitting down carving this into stone or even writing books for that matter when we're starving and trying to search for food. This kind of indicates that there's some cycles that we are going through here on Earth and trying to go through the similarities in these. Now, Solon is from 640 was the BC was the date he was born, and to avoid confusion, this quote does not refer to the 14th century but to the legend of Atlantis. So he was talking to the Egyptian priest long ago. Now, one of the differences I have with Sasha's incredible work here is the dating on things, because he lists very specific dates, and 13, 15, this and that. But let me show you what we're looking at when we start talking about the Maunder minimum. Now, I've already covered in other videos how they really don't know when it started and when it ended. It's anywhere from 1200 AD all the way to 650 AD when it started. They really don't know how long it lasts. And I've even covered how they do ice core samples, tree rings, dendrochronology, and they compare that with what it is the amount of carbon 14 in the ice core samples, because the carbon 14 amounts vary when there's low sunspot activity, which is why I have such a problem with carbon 14 dating, because they are clearly saying that the carbon 14 fluctuates, and the way they do carbon dating is they measure the parts per million that is in an organic sample and compare it to today's amount of carbon 14 in the atmosphere, and that can drastically change quickly. And so it seems like if we have a contingent straight through history from the 1300s up to present, then we wouldn't be guessing when the Maunder minimum started and when it ended. But we have comets, we have all of these crazy stories of foul-smelling odors, and then the plague and volcanoes going off at the same time, all of this stuff. And then at the Dalton minimum, another low cycle. And when it comes to solar cycles, our records only go back to 1755, which is fishy in itself, because people have been watching the sky ever since the dawn of time, if you ask me. So we saw all of the events of the 1812 era that I've been making such a fuss about on here. If you happen to be new to my channel, this one I just kind of threw in that all of the lower Mississippi was inundated with flooding in 1809. It's getting about time that I'm going to have to redo the Rosetta Stone of Mudflood. It's got some really good information in it, and I was horrible at making videos. Honestly, I thought about 500 people would see it. That's not the case. And so at the Dalton minimum here, we had Tecumseh's Comet roll through. We had the Nematode earthquakes, 2,000 earthquakes in central Midwest, and between 6,000 and 10,000 earthquakes in the Boot Hill of Missouri. Now, when I redo the video, I'm going to add a lot more information to the Rosetta Stone about actual manifest destiny. And Westerners were not inland in America at that time, and I will show all of the evidence for that. So we had comets, earthquakes. There was a series of earthquakes that led up to the 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora, which led to the year without winter, or 1800, and froze to death. And of course, when you have anything like that, cholera would be the number one disease that I would think that you would come across, because you'd have starving livestock, this and that. It would contaminate the drinking water. That's why I've been telling everybody the most important thing you could possibly have to stay self-sufficient is a good water filter. All right, let's get back around here to the book, and let me show you what interesting symbol I came across while looking into comets. I just got done talking about this symbol right here and how it came from the old world, but nobody truly seems to know what that symbol means. It definitely got hijacked back in the 30s and 40s, but here's some old Chinese symbols. We've seen it all over Nordic and Tibetan. This symbol is everywhere. Might be starting to make a little bit of sense, huh? So let's get back to some of Sasha's writings here. Once again, he lists all of his resources and in there if you guys want to go read it. JFC Hecker tells us that during the Black Death in Denmark and Norway, people were so occupied with their own misery that the accustomed voyages to Greenland ceased. Towering icebergs formed at the same time on the coast of East Greenland in consequence of the general concussion of Earth's organism, and no mortal from that time forward has ever seen the shore or its inhabitants. Indeed, the northern and eastern shores of Greenland, which had been mapped in detail by the Norse during their settlement era, are still covered in glacial ice to this day. Probably few places escaped, perhaps not any, for the annals of contemporaries report that throughout the land only a tenth part of the inhabitants remained alive. In Poland, the affected were attacked with spitting blood and died in a few days in such vast numbers that, as it has been affirmed, scarcely a fourth of the inhabitants were left. There's kind of a lot to think about there. I've already covered how a lot of the Norse history all got burned up in one single fire. It's like they hijacked all of their history, except for the oral traditions handed down. Also with this, I mean, oh, that's what I was thinking. So here we clearly have a record that Westerners, Norse type, whatever the proper term is, they sailed back and forth freely to Greenland, but they didn't go the extra step. I would think that it would probably be a harder journey to go from Europe to Greenland than from Greenland to North America. And we do have evidence of Gaelic writing, all kinds of evidence of Westerners being on the mainland of America that all gets Smithsonianed and washed, straight out of memory. To continue with Hecker. In thousands of places, chasms were formed from whence arose noxious vapors, and as at that time natural occurrences were transformed into miracles, it was reported that a fire meteor which descended on the earth far in the east had destroyed everything within a circumference of more than 200 leagues. That is 600 miles. Infecting the air far and wide. The consequences of innumerable floods contributed to the same effect. Vast river districts had been converted into swamps. Foul vapors arose everywhere, increased by the odor of purified locusts. That's what it says. Which had never perhaps darkened the sun in thicker swarms, and of countless corpses, which even in the well-regulated countries of Europe they knew not how to remove quickly enough out of the sight of the living. It is probable, therefore, that the atmosphere contained foreign and sensibly perceptible admixture to the great extent which, at least in the lower regions, could not be decomposed or rendered ineffective by separation. Now he's talking about these huge how did he call it? These huge chasms opening up. And I wanted to point out once again that we have these old lakes, one in North America here, which this is located just south of where I believe that old lake used to be. And then you find the Black Canyon of Gunnison National Park, which is a very beautiful place that looks just like this. And you find the Grand Gulf down below this old lake. Over in Africa, you have this old lake Zaire Lacus. And now this looks like it is modern day Lake Victoria. So here is modern day Lake Victoria and no Zaire Lacus. What we do have though is Victoria Falls down below here. And this is it in extreme drought, but it just looks like a big chasm opened up and the earth fell in. And also over in Namibia, I got a lot of flack on that one first time around. In Namibia, I still can't say it. We have the Fish River Canyon. So Africa, America, Africa, America. All right by these old lakes. It's just too much coincidence for me. So it has always bothered me, the official story on the Grand Canyon. I'll have to. I've still got the pictures of the actual plaque that is there trying to explain it. I'll have to do a video on that at some point. On with comets. The comet of 1348, this heavenly anomaly, probably indeed a comet, was seen over Paris in August of 1348, just a few months before the outbreak of the plague in that country, but 6 months after the great earthquake of Friuli and the outbreak of pestilence in Italy. More comets, more earthquakes. I can't remember. We may come across a volcano again here in a second. The description comes from Jean Filon, called Jean de Vanille. Sure, why not? In 1368, a French poet, historian, and chronicler. Quote, pestilence and its attendant tribulations appeared again in various parts of the world. In the month of August 1348, after Vespers, when the sun was beginning to set, a big and very bright star appeared above Paris towards the west. It did not seem, as stars usually do, to be very high above our hemisphere, but rather very near. As the sun set and the night came on, this star did not seem to me, or to many other friars who were watching it, to move from one place. At length, when night had come, this big star, to the amazement of all of us who were watching, broke into many different rays, as it shed its rays over Paris towards the east, totally disappeared and was completely annihilated. Whether it was a comet or not, whether it was composed of airy exhalations and was finally resolved into vapor, I leave to the discretion of astronomers. It is, however, possible that it was a presage to the amazing pestilence to come, which in fact followed very shortly in Paris and throughout France and elsewhere, as I shall tell. All this year and the next, the mortality of men and women, of the young even more than the old. Sounding the trumpets, huh? And the comet breaking into many pieces. Here you have the Chinese accounts of all of this, and look at the petroglyphs we have all around the world. What are they saying? You know, they saw something. Back to the book. It is evidently not just a product of superstition that comets were associated throughout history with upheaval and the fate of the human race, changes on our planet that are not just metaphorical but literal. Even 800 years earlier, Chinese astronomers had a clear understanding of connecting comets to terrestrial upheaval of any description and also to pandemics. In the Record of World's Change, Li Chunfeng, 602 AD, of the Imperial Astronomical Bureau, told you, see, they even had a Bureau of Imperial Astronomy in 648 AD, we read that comets are vile stars. Every time they appear in the south, something happens to wipe out the old and establish the new. When a comet appears in the constellation Andromeda, there are floods and migrations of the people. Many rise up and the country is divided by civil war. When a comet appears in the constellation Pisces, there is first drought and later flooding. Rice is expensive, domesticated animals die, and an epidemic strikes the army. See how accurate and long the Chinese have been keeping records, that they can even tell you what happens when the comet is in certain astrological signs? Amazing. The most modern scientific community constantly reassures us that comets have no tangible effect on human experience apart from a very few extremely rare impact events. We'll get to that in a second. But at least the physicists and administrators at CERN seem to be interested in ancient comet descriptions, along with Copernican solar system models and other stepping stones of enlightened science. So we all know that CERN is up to some pretty nefarious stuff over there, and they like to know what's going on with comets. The Vatican likes to know what's going on with comets, but we're not even supposed to be looking up into the sky, right? Oh, that's what I was wondering. So the Tunguska event, I did want to point this out because a lot of this he does mention in here that there was no impact crater of these comets. And I just want to point out that the Tunguska event was supposedly a big comet meteorite type event, but there was no impact crater. It just blew everything up out in a remote part of Siberia or Tartaria. So naturally, if something like this happened, then you would have people ready to go to war over resources. I used to joke with my vegan girlfriend that you can thank vegetarians for all of the wars on Earth, because if we were just hunters and gatherers, we wouldn't be warring against each other. It was the introduction of agriculture. If I've said many, many times, and every single war in our modern history were of conscripts. They had to draft people. They had to force people to go to war. Hunger ain't no joke. Starvation ain't a joke. And yes, if things went horribly bad, people will fight over food in a major, major way. So this led to Failing food supplies quite rapidly caused or triggered armed invasions and war for control of remaining croplands. The 1315 Flanders campaign of Louis X, who ruled large parts of today's France, was an example. While 1315 was disastrous, the previous year had been almost as bad for farming output across much of Europe due to persistent cold and torrential rains. Now he gets into a little bit of earthquake lights. And I think I did or did not. Yes, I did find this old drawing of, if you look into earthquake lights, look it up on your own, guys. And no, I'm not putting a link in there. You're grown people. You can look up earthquake lights. Just type it into Google or Bing or Start Page or whatever it is you do. I don't have to leave a link for this. Orbs are reported everywhere, and these strange lights. And I just keep thinking of, the whole electric universe, because it makes perfect sense to me. It's everything here is energy. Solid matter is just a very gross form of energy. Just things that aren't moving that fast and everything. But also electrical energy, in my opinion, is kind of a gross form of energy. Everybody tries to, I've heard a lot about the ancients and having free energy and this and that. Well, maybe their energy wasn't the same kind of energy we're even talking about, because when you get down to it, electricity really isn't near as understood as we think it is. We just know the results of it, and we know how to measure it. Anyway, there are much subtler energies, and if I was a super smart, advanced type civilization, I might be more interested in the energies of the human body, much like we see in the Chinese and the qi system. I mean, they have the qi system worked down to a science, and other Eastern practices such as yoga, and deeper forms of yoga don't have too much to do with the actual human body, but the form that we know of here in the West is primarily to do with the body's energies and the chakras. There happens to be 114 of them chakras, not just the 7 that we're all used to hearing. So when we have these earthquakes, it seems like there's some type of electrical discharge that goes off, just like with volcanoes, we have volcanic lightning. So there's definitely energies being thrown out by these huge events. And could it all be connected? Comets coming through, a solar cycle, the sun starts changing. I don't know. It's weird because the sun is on a basically 11-year cycle, but there's a lot of connection everywhere I go between the Maunder minimum being called a grand solar minimum of the sun, and there being a comet there, and then the Dalton minimum being just a solar minimum and a comet being there. So you know how I feel about coincidences. It's just, these things are all too much to be coincidence. All right, let's read the rest of this and finish up. How far do we have to go here? The year 1342 began with an extraordinary cold and heavy snowfall in Germany, followed by the sudden warming in February. The snow melt, water tore down walls, and in Prague, the Moldau River tore away the Judith Bridge, much like a lot of the bridges and flooding we're seeing today. Then snow and frost returned to be then replaced by a very wet spring. Severe local floods had plagued the population of southern Germany, Switzerland, and Austria before the main event. The torrential rains started on July 19th. The harvest had not been brought in. In the end, not only was most of the crop destroyed, but villages lost up to half their farmland due to soil erosion, meaning on half of the fields there was no fertile topsoil left for planting in the following years. This is just exactly like what we are seeing in the the heartland of America right now with our farm fields. I've been covering this, how it's getting flooded, the topsoil is getting eroded away, and it's leaving sand deposits. And last I checked, I think about 30% of the annual crops have only been planted. And now, I mean, now we're getting to where it's almost too late to plant soybeans, which can be planted much later in the year. Guys, 1 year of this, all right. 2 years of this, we're getting into some sketchy ground. Even Admiral Byrd, when he went down to Antarctica and came back and said way too much on TV, he was talking about, yeah, it's bacteria free. It's a great place to store food for the 7 lean years. The 7 lean years. The before mentioned Hans Rudolf Bork of the University of Kiel, who conducted several intense studies on the 1342 flood, stated that the volumes of water were enormous. They were 50 to 100 times higher than during the flooding of the order of 1997 or the Elbe River in 2002 and 2013. Eyewitness accounts claim that, quote, in this summer, there was a great inundation of waters throughout our zone. This was not caused by rainfall, but it seemed that the waters gushed out from everywhere, even out of the peaks of the mountains and over the walls of the city of Cologne they traversed with boats. The rivers Danube, Rhine, and Main carried away towers, very strong city walls, bridges, houses, and the fortification walls of the city. Mud flood much? And the portals of heavens were open, and rain fell onto earth like in the 600th year of Noah. It happened in Wurzburg that the river Main crushed the bridge with its might and forced many to leave their homes. The destruction of the bridge is also confirmed in the chronicles of the city of Wurzburg. In some cities, water levels were up to 10 meters above normal, 30 feet above normal. Churches were inundated up to the roof alongside all great rivers of Europe and the small tributaries. The inundation destroyed towns, peoples, trees, fields, and meadows completely and carried all to the lower parts of the stream. Johannes von Brittkrieg. People always live and congregate next to the rivers. We still do it next to the ocean. Water is a vital part of life. So if all these towns were set up on the sides of rivers and they flooded away, then there goes most of the civilization. Traversing over the city walls of Cologne in a boat, that used to appear to the historians of the last century as a gross exaggeration, to say the least, but the archaeological and geological data suggests that this could have been indeed possible. 1/3 of the entire soil erosion of the last 1,500 years took place in this week. Many villages were lost, more than a half of their agricultural land. You can tell that's actually a very mainstream scientist there saying that. So we just have all kinds of evidence that this stuff has happened in history. Therefore, in my humble opinion, it seems like it could happen again. That's it for this one. We're going to start getting into some of the earthquakes here. And if anybody's still watching this, I'll keep going. It's pretty interesting here, centered in the South Alpine region of, I'll have to look up that town. The quake was felt across almost all of Europe. The quake hit in the same year that the plague situation escalated in Italy. The outbreak followed only months later. About 200 contemporary sources mention this event. It caused considerable damage to structures, churches, and houses collapsed. Villages were destroyed. Interestingly, witnesses also reported that foul odors emanated from the earth. It also says that the impact of this quake was felt for 1,400 kilometers, where nowadays a larger magnitude of 7.0 is usually not felt for a distance of more than 500 kilometers. We're talking 3 times stronger than a 7.0, which I guess the Richter scale does go up exponentially for each one. So what are we talking? That's a 9 or a 10. Anyway, it's a major freaking earthquake that did happen at some point in history, that we have a lot of people that did write something down about it. Like I said, I still question the dates because of Scaligerian chronology. Anyway, that's it for this one. I love you guys. Take care of yourselves out there. We are all one. Static out.